Stepmom and dad ditched me for their honeymoon with their daughters. Now they're banned from my house. Some people believe family is everything. That blood means loyalty. That parents always have their children's best interests at heart. I used to believe that too, until my father showed me that some people only care about what they can take. I was 22 years old when my stepmother and father tried to steal my house. Not their house. Mine. It was the house I grew up in. The house my mother left me when she passed away. The house they thought they could walk into and claim as their own. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. My parents divorced when I was 7. I lived between them. But my mother? She was the one who truly raised me. She was kind. She was supportive. She put me before everything else. My father? He was too busy. Too busy with work. Too busy chasing women. Too busy building a life that barely included me. And honestly, I was fine with that. Because as long as I had my mother, I didn't need him. Then, a year ago, my mother passed away. A sudden stroke. One moment she was fine, and the next, she was gone. I wasn't just grieving. I was lost. But even in death, my mother protected me. Because before she passed, she wrote a will. And in that will, she left everything to me, including our house. My father didn't like that. Not one bit. The moment he realized that he wasn't getting the house, he became cold. He started acting bitter. He kept making comments about how unfair it was. As if my mother owed him something. As if I owed him something. I ignored it. Because I was still mourning. And at the time, I thought he was too. I didn't realize. He wasn't mourning my mother. He was mourning the loss of her house. 6 months later, my father announced his engagement to Julia. Julia was 38 years old and had 2 daughters from a previous relationship. An 18-year-old, Olivia. A 16-year-old, Sophie. I had no problem with them. At first, the wedding was set to take place in my hometown. My father had moved to another state for work, but now, he wanted to come back. He said it was because he missed home. He said it was because he wanted to spend time with me. He said it was because he wanted to feel like a family. And I believed him, like an idiot. So when he asked if he, Julia, and her daughters could stay with me leading up to the wedding, I said yes. I thought it would be nice to have company. I thought we could finally reconnect. I thought I was doing something good. I should have known better. At first, everything was fine. Julia was sweet. Her daughters were quiet but polite. My father acted like he actually wanted to be around me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a family again. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, my father dropped a bomb on me. We were sitting in the living room when he turned to me, casual as ever, and said, "I was thinking, maybe we could make this permanent." I blinked. "Make what permanent?" He smiled. "Us living here, together, as a family." I stared at him, because suddenly, everything clicked. Why he was being so nice. Why Julia kept calling this house home. Why Olivia and Sophie were getting comfortable, too comfortable. They weren't just visiting. They were moving in. And they had planned this from the start. I hesitated, because part of me wanted to say yes. I was lonely, and for the first time in a year, I wasn't alone. But something felt off. A gut feeling. Something telling me to wait. So I did. I told him I needed time to think. And that was the best decision I ever made. Because 2 days after the wedding, they all left without a word. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone. At first, I panicked. Then, I called Julia, and the moment she answered, I knew everything had changed. Her voice was different. Cold. Distant. "Oh, we're on our honeymoon," she said casually. I frowned. "You didn't tell me." She laughed. "We forgot." Then, she told me something that made my blood boil. She sighed dramatically. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. My husband now has a new family, and you need to accept that. Maybe by the time we get back, you'll have learned to be more considerate." And then, she hung up. Like I was nothing. Like this wasn't my house. Like I wasn't even part of the family. I sat there, phone still in my hand, heart pounding in my chest. And in that moment, I made a decision. They weren't coming back. They weren't taking this house from me. They weren't going to walk all over me. Because this was war. And I was going to win. I sat in my empty house, staring at my phone. replaying Julia's words over and over again. My husband now has a new family, and you need to accept that. Like I wasn't part of it. Like I was just some outsider standing in their way. And the worst part? They actually thought I was going to sit here and take it. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was weak. They had no idea who they were messing with. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. My father had been acting strange since moving back in. Julia had been getting too comfortable in my house. Olivia and Sophie had started calling it home. They weren't just treating this like a place to stay. They were claiming it, which meant they had a plan, and I needed to figure out what it was. So I did the one thing they never expected me to do. I started digging. I checked my parents' old documents. I went through my mother's will. I reviewed every legal record I could find. And that's when I found it. The thing that changed everything. My father wasn't on the deed. Not then. Not now. Not ever. The house had always belonged to my mother. And when she passed, she left it to me. Meaning my father had no legal claim to it whatsoever. And if he thought he could just walk in and take it, he was in for a very, very rude awakening. But first, I needed to see just how far they were willing to go. 3 days later, Julia called me. At first, I thought she was reaching out to apologize, maybe to smooth things over. But the second I picked up, I realized she wasn't calling to make peace. She was calling to deliver an ultimatum. We've decided that it's time for you to move on, she said smoothly. I almost laughed. Move on? I repeated. From what? She sighed dramatically. This house, sweetie. It's too big for you, and my daughters deserve a stable home. I gripped my phone tighter. So let me get this straight, I said. You leave for your honeymoon without telling me. You ignore me for days. And now you're telling me to leave my own house? She didn't even hesitate. Yes. I let out a slow breath. Because suddenly, everything made sense. They had never planned to include me in their new family. They had always intended to push me out. And they thought I was dumb enough to go along with it. Well, they were about to learn the hard way that I wasn't going anywhere. I kept my voice calm, controlled. Oh, and what if I say no? Julia chuckled. Oh, honey, it's already done. Your father started the process weeks ago. I froze. The process? Her voice turned sweet, almost pitying. He's putting the house on the market. I almost dropped my phone. Because this was worse than I thought. My father had already started the paperwork. He was planning to sell the house out from under me, and he thought I wouldn't fight back. I clenched my jaw. Big mistake. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. I hope you enjoyed your honeymoon, Julia. She hesitated. What? I smiled. Because when you come back, you won't have a house to return to. And then, I hung up. Because now, this wasn't just about keeping my home. This was about destroying them. I spent the next 3 days preparing. I hired a lawyer. I locked down my financial records. And most importantly, I filed a legal notice blocking the sale of my house. Because what my father failed to realize was that he didn't own it. He never did. And now, he never would. When they returned from their honeymoon, I was waiting. The second they stepped through the door, suitcases in hand, I met them with a smile. My father frowned. What are you doing here? I raised an eyebrow. I live here. What are you doing here? Julia rolled her eyes. Enough of this nonsense. We need to discuss your move-out date. I laughed. Oh, you mean the house you tried to sell? The house you had no legal right to? My father stiffened. And Julia? Her face drained of color. Because they knew. They knew they had lost. I stepped forward, holding up the legal documents. This house, I said, voice cold, belongs to me. Not you. Not your daughters. Not anyone else. Just me. My father's jaw clenched. You don't mean that. I smirked. Oh, I do. Then I pointed to their luggage. And I said the words that ended everything. You have 30 minutes to get out of my house. Silence. Pure, stunned silence. Then, Julia exploded. She screamed. She ranted. She demanded I be reasonable. She said I was being selfish. She said I was breaking the family apart. She even had the audacity to say I was making my father homeless. I didn't care. Not anymore. Because I had spent my whole life being cast aside. And now, I was taking my power back. My father tried one last time. Please, he said, voice strained. Think about this. I smiled. I already did. Then I walked past them, and I locked the door behind me. Because this was the last time I would ever let them control me. By the end of the day, they were gone. The house was mine, and I was finally free. But this wasn't over, because they weren't going to take this loss lightly, and their next move would be the dirtiest one yet. I should have known they wouldn't go down quietly, that Julia wouldn't just pack up and move on, that my father wouldn't just accept his loss, that they would do everything in their power to punish me for standing my ground. Because entitled people, they don't learn. They just get more desperate. It started with the phone calls. From my father. From Julia. From random relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. The messages were all the same. You're being cruel. You're breaking the family apart. Your father raised you, and this is how you repay him? I laughed. Because the idea that my father ever raised me? That was the biggest joke of all. I ignored them. I figured they'd get bored and move on. But Julia? She wasn't done. And her next move? Crossed the line. I came home from work one evening to find my front door unlocked. At first, I thought maybe I had forgotten to lock it. But the second I stepped inside, I knew. The furniture had been moved around. There were suitcases in the living room. And sitting on my couch, drinking my wine, acting like she owned the place, was Julia. She turned to me, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Oh, you're home," she said brightly. I stared at her. Then, I saw Olivia and Sophie sitting at the dining table, scrolling through their phones like this was completely normal. My jaw tightened. "What the hell are you doing here?" Julia sighed, setting down her glass. "We decided to move back in." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She tilted her head. "Come on. You didn't think we'd just leave, did you?" She laughed. "This is our home too." I clenched my fists. "No, it's not." She sighed, like she was so tired of explaining basic things to me. "You need to start thinking about the bigger picture, sweetheart. You can't just live here alone. It's selfish." I exhaled slowly, because this was insanity. "I legally evicted you," I said, voice calm. "You are trespassing." Julia rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop being dramatic. I have a key." I froze. "A key?" I took a slow step forward, heart pounding. "Where did you get that key?" She smirked. "Your father had copies made, just in case." My blood boiled. He had made copies of my house key behind my back, because he had always planned on taking my home. I took out my phone. Julia frowned. "What are you doing?" I smiled. "Calling the police." Her smirk disappeared. "You wouldn't," she scoffed. I tilted my head. "Try me." Then, I pressed dial. Julia panicked. She stood up, hands raised. Okay. No need for that. Let's talk." I crossed my arms. "Talk about what?" She hesitated. Then, she said the words that made me want to throw her out right then and there. "This house should have gone to your father," she said, voice cold. I laughed. "Oh, really?" She nodded. "You don't deserve it. You're young. You don't have a family. You don't need a house this size. It should belong to people who can actually make use of it." I took a slow breath. "People like you?" She smiled. "Exactly. That was the moment I snapped. I didn't care about being polite. I didn't care about keeping the peace. I didn't care about family loyalty, because they had shown me over and over again that they weren't my family. "You have exactly 5 minutes to get out," I said, voice deadly calm. Julia stiffened. "Or what?" I smirked. "Or the cops will drag you out." She laughed. A cold, bitter, fake laugh. "You wouldn't dare." I raised an eyebrow. "Try me." Then, I pressed speaker. The moment the 911 operator answered, Julia crumbled. She scrambled for her purse, grabbed her coat, and started yelling at Olivia and Sophie to pack up. She called me a selfish brat. She said I would regret this. She accused me of ruining my father's life. And I just watched, because for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt powerful. By the time the police arrived, Julia and her daughters were already out of the house. I changed the locks. I installed security cameras. I filed a formal police report, because if they ever tried this again, I would have legal proof to make sure they never set foot near me again. That night, my father called. I let it go to voicemail. His message? You went too far. You're acting like a spoiled child. If you don't fix this, you'll regret it. I smiled. Then, I blocked his number. That was the last time I ever spoke to my father. Julia never tried to come back. Olivia and Sophie never contacted me again. And me? I was finally completely free, because for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself, and I would never look back. I thought that was the end, that after I threw Julia out, after I changed the locks, after I filed the police report, they would finally leave me alone, that they would realize I wasn't going to bend, that my father would finally accept that he had lost. But I should have known. People like him, they don't accept defeat. They escalate. And his next move was the most disgusting, unforgivable betrayal yet. It started with a letter. Not from him, not from Julia, but from a lawyer. A formal notice that my father was trying to challenge my mother's will. He was claiming she had been mentally unfit when she signed it, that she had been coerced into leaving everything to me, that as her former spouse, he was entitled to part of the estate. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the paper, my hands shaking with rage. This wasn't just greed anymore. This was a direct attack on my mother's memory. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer immediately. He sighed, already expecting my reaction. I won't let this happen, I said. He chuckled. Oh, trust me. He doesn't have a case. I blinked. What? My lawyer leaned back. Your mother was of completely sound mind when she wrote her will. There's medical proof. Witnesses. And your father? He was divorced from her for over a decade. He has no claim to anything. I let out a slow breath. So this is a what? A bluff? Exactly, my lawyer said. He's hoping to scare you into settling, into giving him something so he'll go away. I smirked. Well then, let's make sure he gets nothing. For weeks, my father dragged it out. He sent letters. He made more legal threats. He even got extended family involved, trying to turn them against me. But it didn't work, because every time he tried, I fought back harder. Then one day, it just stopped. The calls, the threats, the legal letters, gone. Like he had just given up. At first, I thought it was another trick, that he was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. But then I got a call from Sarah, my cousin, and what she told me made me realize he had finally lost. Sarah was out of breath, laughing when she called. You are not going to believe this, she said. I leaned forward. What? She let out a deep sigh. Julia left him. I blinked. Excuse me? Sarah cackled. She took Olivia and Sophie and ran. Moved out. Completely ghosted him. I sat there, stunned, because after everything he had done for her, after choosing her over me, she had left him the second he became useless. The irony was almost too perfect. Apparently, when my father lost the case, Julia saw the writing on the wall. He had no house, no legal way to take mine, no inheritance from my mother. And Julia? She wasn't sticking around for a man with nothing, so she packed up and left. And my father was now completely alone. Sarah hesitated before continuing. He actually called me, you know. I frowned. Why? She sighed. To ask about you. I rolled my eyes. Let me guess. He wants me to forgive him. Sarah hesitated. Then, she said something that stunned me. No, she said quietly. He wants to know if you'll help him. I blinked. Help him? She exhaled slowly. He's broke. Julia drained him. He's drowning in legal fees. He's desperate. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Good. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, carefully. He's still your dad, you know. I clenched my jaw. No, Sarah. He was never my dad. She sighed. You really think you'll never talk to him again? I smirked. Oh, I don't think. I know. Then I hung up, because I was done. That was the last time I ever heard about my father. He lost the house. He lost his money. He lost everything. And me? I had finally, completely won. Because after years of being the afterthought, of being cast aside, of being treated like I didn't matter, I was the only one left standing, and I would never look back. I used to think closure meant forgiveness. That one day, I'd wake up and feel the urge to make amends. That I'd finally let my father back in. That I'd move past the betrayal and be part of a family again. But after everything he did, I realized something. Some people don't deserve forgiveness. Some people only deserve to be forgotten. For months after Julia left him, my father tried everything. He reached out to extended family, hoping someone would guilt me. He even sent letters, asking if we could talk. He tried to frame himself as the victim, but I never responded. I had spent too many years chasing his approval, and now I had finally stopped running. Then one day, I got a final call. Not from him, from a lawyer. At first, I thought he was trying to sue me again, but when I picked up, the lawyer's tone was different. Solemn, careful. "Your father has passed away," he said, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. I waited for sadness. I waited for regret. I waited for any emotion at all, but it never came. Because to me, my father had been gone for a long time. The lawyer cleared his throat. "There are some matters we need to discuss." I almost laughed. "Let me guess. He left me something?" The lawyer hesitated. "Yes, his remaining assets." I smirked. "Let me stop you there." Then, I said the words that sealed my closure forever. "I don't want them." Silence. The lawyer stammered. "Or are you sure? It's still—" I cut him off. "I don't want a cent from that man." He tried to convince me that it was free money, that it was rightfully mine, that I should at least take time to think about it. But I had already made up my mind, because after everything, I didn't need his money. I didn't need his guilt-ridden inheritance, and I sure as hell didn't need to carry his legacy. I was done. I left that call with no regrets. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't ask for details. I didn't say goodbye, because honestly, I had already said goodbye years ago. The moment he chose Julia over me, the moment he tried to steal my home, the moment he tried to erase my mother's memory, that was the day he died to me. I don't know what happened to Julia and her daughters. I don't care. For all I know, she probably found another man to leech off of. My father? He bet everything on her. And in the end, she walked away with everything. Poetic justice, really. As for me, I moved forward. I kept my home. I built a life without them. I found real happiness. Because for years, I thought I had to fight for family, that I had to earn love. But the truth? Real family doesn't make you prove yourself. Real family doesn't try to take from you. Real family doesn't make you feel like you are replaceable. And my father? He was never real family. The day I truly moved on, I did something symbolic. I took the last picture I had of him, a framed one from when I was a kid. I didn't burn it. I didn't break it. I just threw it away. Because I didn't need a dramatic ending. I had already one. And I didn't need a reminder of someone who never really mattered. So this is my real ending. No more guilt. No more regrets. No more looking back. Just peace. And trust me, it feels amazing.